Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is a Washington, D.C. update where we will be covering policy developments from the federal government. I'm Caitlin Sickles. I'm a senior principal in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. And on today's webinar, I'm joined by my colleague Paul Nathanson, also at Bracewell, as well as your team from the Franklin Partnership, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. Today's webinar, like all of these webinars, is brought to you by NTMA and PMA. Your team here includes both the on-the-ground lobbyists here in Washington, D.C., representing the manufacturing industry and making sure the voice is particularly small and medium-sized manufacturers are heard here in Washington, D.C., as well as your media team. So making sure that our policy messages come through in the media and on social media as well. Lots to cover today, as always. We will have a busy agenda, but before I get to that, let me mention that today's webinar is generally and generously sponsored by Federated Insurance. So before we get to the presentation, I want to introduce Jack West from Federated Insurance to say a few words. Jack, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin, and happy Friday to everyone. And as John just reminded me, it's Cinco de Mayo, so happy Cinco de Mayo, and a perfect timing for a Friday, right? Well, my name is Jack West, and on behalf of Federated, we are excited for the opportunity to sponsor today's webinar. For nearly 120 years, Federated has been a huge promoter and sponsor of the association movement, and today exclusively recommended by over 500 state and national trade associations and buying groups. We are extremely proud of our partnerships with PMA, along with several of the NTMA chapters as well. We applaud both organizations for their efforts in advocacy and for arranging their One Voice webinar series. We look forward to today's webinar and continuing our mission to help your businesses succeed. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Jack, and we really appreciate Federated's sponsorship of the webinar and, of course, your support. So now we've got our agenda for today up on the screen, and I am going to turn it over to John to give us the latest on where we are in what's going on with Congress.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thank you, Jack, for sponsoring this webinar. This week is like the calm before the storm, and it's going to happen in Washington next week. The government is running up to its debt ceiling limit, and they got to increase the debt ceiling. Both parties, both sides have put off negotiating an agreement, and for the leaders, President Biden and House Republicans will be meeting for the first time next Tuesday. First serious discussions about how to raise the debt ceiling. Last week, the Congress passed. 2 weeks ago, the Congress passed a bill which increased the debt ceiling for 1 year, but also provided some directions of how they want to limit government spending and such. And that was a very controversial bill. It passed on a party line vote. It wasn't so much the content of what was in the bill, it was whether Kevin McCarthy, the speaker, could actually pass something. If he was unable to pass something, it really would have negatively impacted House Republicans' ability to negotiate an agreement with the president. So fast forward to next week or this week, Treasury Secretary Yellen announced that the government will hit their hard debt limit on June 1. Many are skeptical about the Treasury Secretary's expectation of June 1. Many thought it would be the government would have to increase the debt ceiling sometime mid to late June. And so with that June 1 date, it's really accelerated what has to happen. And the same day that the Treasury Secretary announced the June 1 date, the president reached out to Speaker McCarthy to start the discussions or to plan this meeting for next Tuesday to start those negotiations.
Right, and so looking backwards, the president and the Speaker of the House, McCarthy, have not met since February 1st of this year. So it's been a couple of months since they've gotten together. To John's point, the U.S. House of Representatives on a party line vote, or not party line, but by just one vote. McCarthy lost 4, his max that he could have lost on it. They did move a bill. It's not as important what's in the bill, to John's point, but what is important is the proof of concept here that McCarthy could actually move a bill, since many in the White House thought he did not have the votes to be able to get something through. The 4 votes he lost were on the right flank. They were not the moderates. And so that's a good sign, at least from the McCarthy standpoint, that he does now prove that he can pass a bill up on Capitol Hill. Now, the timeline is still going to be long. Now, we don't think that by June 1st, rather, we're going to have an agreement here. We are starting to hear some talk among some about a temporary extension, maybe even just for 30 days. Others want to align it with the federal spending fiscal year that comes up on September 30th. So there's still a lot of posturing and processes to go through, but we have less than a dozen days where both the House and the Senate are both in town, neither of which are returning until Tuesday of next week, which is May 9th. So that tells you they don't have a lot of room to go and to maneuver on here. So we'll see if that June 1st date holds, or if they do, Congress extends it, or if Treasury floats it till the quarterly estimates start coming in. But we will get to what's in that bill later on as they start to formulate some kind of an agreement. But in the meantime,
I'm not sure what you think, Omar. I think it'll be a 30-day extension, but that's just my take.
yeah, I don't think that they want to give up enough leverage, they being Republicans, to give up the whole summer for negotiations. I don't think that there's that moderate wing that's going to just start putting together a committee to review it. I think you're right. I think they just want to get going as quickly as possible on this one, especially as McCarthy has some momentum on it. No, but what we are seeing is they're going to see quite a bit in the media, John, don't you think, over the next coming weeks? And also from Capitol Hill, this is going to take all the oxygen out of the room, and most folks are going to be focusing on the debt ceiling, even though there's plenty of other legislation that needs to be acted on.
The interesting part is we see this with negotiations in Washington. If you hear a lot of leaks, to me, that tells us it's not a serious negotiation, or it tells us that the negotiation is not going well. If there's not many leaks, it says, okay, maybe they are really serious about getting something done. So,
that's right. And so for those that are looking at getting something done, the debt ceiling, that was just more of the process vote. So now we know that he can move something. Where are we on the research and development section 174? Where are we on bonus depreciation and 163J? Many of those, as we call them, the big 3 tax provisions that are out there. We do know that there's been a concerted effort on Capitol Hill to advance these at our behest and other groups as well. What is the latest? We do now have bipartisan legislation in the House and the Senate. We do have about 24 or so co-sponsors, bipartisan equal balance in the Senate for the American Innovation and Jobs Act S866, introduced by Senator Todd Young, Republican of Indiana, and Maggie Hessen, a Democrat of New Hampshire. And we also have a bill now introduced in the House of Representatives, also bipartisan, that would be on the R&D. Now, please, just a little bit of warning. We do know that the bill that's been introduced does call for making R&D expensing permanent. We do not believe that will be the final outcome. We are likely looking at more of a reinstatement, and for a couple of years here to align with 2025 is what we are hearing. But we do now have bipartisan legislation that is at least out there for the R&D that's been introduced, and also on the 163J reinstating the full standard for depreciation amortization as part of your business loans. One that's not as does not have bipartisan sponsorship is the bonus depreciation, taking it back up to 100%. As you all know, on January 1st, it slipped down to 80% from that 100 rate. That is also one of the big 3 that we do expect Republicans to try to move. Now, a couple of things, and John, jump in here in a second. The timeline, because many of you are asking what's going to happen on section 174 on the research and development expensing, and more importantly, the requirement for capitalization and amortization over 5 years. What we are hearing is we do not expect to see a solution that would happen here in the next 30 days. We see it difficult, especially to what we just laid out on the debt ceiling, to see an agreement and a solution on R&D even this summer. We possibly are looking into, to be honest, closer to the October, November, December timeframe, which starts to be risky in terms of retroactivity. But I think, John, if the House does prove that they want to move on these 3, I think then they're just trying to draw the Senate into negotiations over R&D and some of the other Democratic priorities on the Senate side.
Yeah, you're right. The R&D bill is retroactive to January 1st of last year. However, the longer these negotiations go, as you pointed out, Omar, I think the less likelihood is that we'll be able to get a R&D fix that is retroactive to January 1, 2022, just because it's just no longer, as the weeks and months go by, it makes it more and more expensive to do that R&D fix. But I do agree with you. The House is probably going to move first sometime in the summer, and then we'll see what the Senate will be able to pass. Senator Schumer has made it clear to his members that he has asked them not to co-sponsor tax bills, that are, and so that's why we're seeing bonus depreciation not being a bipartisan bill, at least in the Senate. But we are seeing Democrat senators co-sponsor the legislation for R&D and the 163J, the bonus interest loan deductibility bills.
So thank you to all that did send an action alert to Capitol Hill on Tuesday at 10 o'clock Eastern. That went out to your inboxes. Those have been helpful in keeping the pressure and raising the awareness on this to get this over the edge, but we are going to need some more patience and more time. I know it's difficult given the amount of tax hit that you all are taking on R&D in particular. A couple of things, we'll just run through these quickly, mostly just pass them on to your HR department. Government contractors, make you aware, we are now nearing the end of a public health emergency, the PHE. Both you saw the World Health Organization and the White House also now make that announcement. So the government has officially repealed vaccine requirements for certain federal requirements there for employees and contractors. And there's the notification. Just in general, this website, the saferfederalworkforce.gov, that is your end all be all. That's where they're going to continue posting for the foreseeable future, any executive orders and others that are related to that. Also simple, FDA's put out simplification on bivalent COVID vaccine use and who's eligible for that, with the expectation that later this year they will address an annual vaccine under COVID. But this also ties into any government requirements that you might have seen, travel requirements as well. Many of those are coming to an end with the end of the PHE here in the next week or so. Lastly, before we jump into some of the OSHA issues, the IRS did issue a number of, and this one is interesting. What they did is put out 3 different FAQs. So if you go to the link down at the bottom to the IRS newsroom, then you'll get a live version of the Affordable Care Act, the FFCA, and some of the other COVID relief and the Affordable Care ones and the ARPA as well for their FAQs with regards to what is coverage and payment requirements. So they did issue separate fact sheets as well. Those were just updated about 3 weeks ago as well for your HR department. But John, we're getting into that May timeframe, which is what you can expect is a big focus on heat issue campaign, at least at the federal level and in California.
As we have mentioned in past webinars and on our Monday morning calls, the OSHA is looking at proposing a rule that would require businesses, when the heat index exceeds 80 degrees, to mitigate the heat. And so Omar and I have sat through many listening sessions with OSHA, with their advisory committees and such. And this is an example of where OSHA is creating a campaign, Beat the Heat, where they're asking individuals and taxpayers and federal employees and all to submit ideas of how to address heat, heat in the workplace. This was originally started as a way to address heat conditions in the construction and landscaping business, but OSHA are putting together this rule. They're going to include all industries moving forward. So here they have a meeting coming up on May 16th. They have another advisory committee hearing on May 31st. OSHA has been very active on this. We don't expect a rule probably this year, but know that there's a lot of activity on this, and we probably expect something early next year.
Okay, so note the Beat the Heat campaign here that we still have up for any registration, not suggesting that you all should, but it definitely shows that this is part of the awareness campaign, to John's point, and absent of a rule to come out from at the federal level, that's what you are starting to see. We did put up last year around this time examples of what OSHA was doing on their awareness campaign about heat and adequate hydration and acclimatization. And that's what John mentioned. There's an NACOSH hearing that's coming up on May 31st. There's a couple of things that are going on there. You'll note that the NACOSH heat work group is going to start reporting on proposed recommendations from their sub-working groups. They've got 2 different working groups that had come out there, and we can go into a little bit more detail on some of their recommendations and some of their priorities there. But in general, what you should expect is that sometime in June and over the summer, that OSHA will start considering some of those working group recommendations. There's a wide variety of them. They, as we'd expected and predicted in the past, they do include things such as PPE requirements, different, lots of training manuals, dissemination of the information on heat as well, and the issues there related. They also talk about how to measure different areas within the workplace to identify whether or not you've exceeded the 80-degree indoor threshold for heat index. So there's a number of recommendations that are potentially going to come out. The working groups that were broken into two parts. One was on communications. That one is completed. The second one couldn't come to an agreement on specific policy recommendations to OSHA, so they combined a list of different best practices that they're going to ask OSHA then to relay that in their proposed rule that we could see some draft of later this year. Similar, just a couple of quick slides from our California friends. What we've seen is that there were about 8 attorneys general from around the country a few months ago that told OSHA that they needed to come up with a heat rule prior to the end of May in advance of the summer season. This is an example of California starting to work on its own and published a proposed indoor heat regulation on, I think, March 31st. And they look at it in a couple of ways. 82 degrees when an employee is present, and they have a number of requirements in there: cool down areas, access to water, requires obviously written heat illness prevention plans on file. That's similar to what we've seen on hazards as well, and response procedures. In addition, they also say indoor workplaces where temperature or heat index reaches at least 87 degrees when they're present, then they also have to look at required implement and assessment and control measures, engineering controls, administrative controls, PPE as well. For our California friends, there will be a public hearing at 10 o'clock Pacific time on May 18th. The reason that we've put this in here for our national audience is during our conversations and part of the working group last year with OSHA, California was held up as one of the models to potentially be used as a federal level. So that's why it's something that we are watching very, very, very closely. Even John, though, sticking with the OSHA issue, this one just keeps going back and forth between administrations on injury and illness reporting.
Yeah, the White House is finalizing, is reviewing OSHA's recommended rule on injury and illness. As you pointed out, this is, between the Trump administration, Obama administration, now the Biden administration, this is bounced back and forth. Under the current requirements, those with 250 or more employees would have to file their 300, 301, 308 forms electronically. Under this new proposed rule that the White House is considering, they received it on April 7th, and so it's well into the review process that employees over 100 would have to file their forms electronically.
Right. So for your planning purposes, likely this is one for next March, when those of you with 100 or more employees would have to be looking at doing the trifecta submission there electronically, in addition to posting them in the shops. That's something to watch out for. Just a quick aside, we didn't put it in here, but just rumors around town on the overtime rule, where right now you're at current overtime time and a half subject to threshold for EAPs is 35,568. They were supposed to release an update to that threshold, possibly as high as 50,000 here in May. We're hearing that might slip possibly into the summer. They don't have a labor secretary right now, but we did see a bill introduced by Senate Democrats that would work to increase the overtime threshold to 45,000 a year, subject time and a half, anybody under that, and then also index it for significant increases and inflation. So just watch out for that one as well. But John, back to you, because I think EPA had one of the busiest Aprils in quite some time, and they're not quite done yet, especially when it comes to vehicles.
Omar, you often say, I've heard you say, if Congress can't legislate it, let's regulate it. And EPA, to your point, has been very aggressive over the summer. They're working on a number of proposals, greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy duty trucks, emission standards for starting model years 2027 and beyond for medium and for light and medium duty trucks. Those comments, comment period is due July 3rd, and then there's the mercury and air toxin standards, and so they have been very aggressive of passing, of regulating the environment.
And you'll continue to see that. It seems to be a whole government approach. It's going to be power plants, vehicles, chemicals, plastics. Obviously, PFAS is a big focus under EPA. If increasingly some of you downstreams are starting to hear about PFAS requests and requirements from your customers, those are coming out there as well. This one also is targeting with regards to there's a lot of metal cleaning, degreasing requirements that are coming up with regards to unreasonable risk determinations that EPA is considering as well. So expect a very, very busy and active next couple of months here on the regulatory side on both OSHA, NLRB, wage hour division, and of course on EPA. A quick couple of things here as we just get into some of the trade and start to bring in some of the Bracewell folks on the steel area here in a few slides as well. Just to start showing you some of the dollars that are going out. Again, this is coming from the White House, so take it with a grain of salt, but these are the hard dollars that they say that are starting to be put out in the last couple of years, in large part, obviously due to the bipartisan action on Capitol Hill with regards to the infrastructure law that was done and the chip semiconductor bill that became law last summer as well. And you can see around the country where some of those investments are going, and you note not as many, again, back to our friends in California, you're seeing it go more in some parts of the Midwest and elsewhere there as well. Two quick grants.
But Omar, I think this very smart politically for the White House. They're spending a heck of a lot of money on the chip and on clean energy, but they're spreading it out around the country, and so that they're gaining, support from those federal legislators in those particular areas.
We were at the NTMA conference last week, and during our presentation, somebody asked with regards to the Inflation Reduction Act and some of these tax provisions, whether or not there's a possibility of them being repealed in this Congress. We still say it's unlikely just because they don't have 60 votes over in the U.S. Senate. But John, your point as well, many of these investments have been done in a lot of bipartisan areas, but honestly, if you look at the numbers, they're leaning more in right-leaning congressional districts, because that's where the companies are choosing to make those investments for a number of reasons in those states. So you're seeing that get spread around, and here's another example. These are grants that are going to go to the states, though, for quote smart manufacturing, as they look at it and the different opportunities and funding availability. Just another example of dollars that are going out there directly for small and medium-sized facilities to be able to reduce trial and error steps during development. And here's a quick snapshot of what they mean by this when they look at smart manufacturing, the use of emerging and advanced technologies to increase the efficiency of the traditional manufacturing process, resulting in fully integrated collaborative manufacturing systems that respond in real time. So you look at a number of these different areas as well as the dollars that are available. A couple last ones here. We did see on the JOLT data come out. I know people are talking about we're seeing a slowdown in some areas of the economy. We still have job openings in manufacturing durable goods. It's 414,000, down from 459,000 last month. And John, we see now, we've talked about this with a little bit on previous slide here, but now electric vehicles are increasingly still not where I think the Biden administration wants them to go, but we are starting to see that being an increased share.
Yeah, I mean, just this chart lays it out. At the end of last year, electric vehicle sales were about 7% of 7% of all automobile sales. Now they're up to close to 10%, and so we're continuing to see consumer comfort in purchasing electric vehicles.
Yeah, and that comfort goes to where are the fast chargers? Are they increasing? And so for those of you that are supplying these industries or competing with some of these industries, these are for your further review at a later time. But we want to tie this all together from the trade standpoint as well. U.S.-Japan minerals agreement has been reached. This is now from a few weeks ago. And just to refresh everyone's memory, when the Inflation Reduction Act was put forward, there was a total of $7,500 tax provision that were included, split into two parts of $3,750 each for your battery components and the electric vehicle components that are manufactured and where they are. And there's a big issue that the Biden administration ran into when they realized a number of allies would no longer be able to be eligible for this. And part of their geopolitical effort to box out China in many ways, they're now looking at how they could bring in Japan and the EU to at least benefit partially. And this is where there's now an agreement broadly on U.S.-Japan minerals agreement with regards to border shipments here and reducing tariff barriers. They're also working on one with the European Union specific to critical minerals. So there's the rare earth elements. Those are the 17 that are on your periodic table. And then there are critical minerals. The critical minerals, there's roughly 50 as the United States Geological Survey defines them. And this is what we're talking about, making sure that these can go across borders without any interruption. And we do understand that the U.S. is working on one with the European Union. We don't have it on this slide, but you'll see in many other areas that China controls roughly over 90% of the critical mineral market that's required for inputs for semiconductors, which, John, is why we're seeing the NSTC, the National Semiconductor Trade Technology Center from the Department of Commerce, get so much attention right now.
And it was included in the semiconductor chip industry, and it's the federal government's answer to the chip industry moving offshore over the past several decades and moving into China. And so this slide, just demonstrates that this is their vision of how we're going to recreate the domestic semiconductor chip industry in this country.
And what the Commerce Department has done is they've created a panel of a lot of industry experts, many of which that they've hired now internally. And for those that are in the chips or relying upon this in the semiconductor phrase, this is how they're trying to incorporate industry. Well, this is really industry's vision that they're trying to push out and put out as well. And part of what we just mentioned on the minerals deal with regards to now China as well, Japan, US, and the Netherlands have now all come together and agreed to restrict certain types of semiconductor shipments to China. Those that want additional details on this, there's a link to a pretty lengthy and informative Bloomberg article that ran last month on that as well. And as we get to transition to some of the metals, we want to put on your radar screen a development that just happened in the last week or so from the European Union with regards to their carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, that is now going to succeed the emissions trading system that the Europeans set up in 2006, somewhere around there. The ETS that they created a number of years ago sounds just like it is, emissions trading system where you can trade carbon credits across within the EU system. Recently, they voted by 487 votes to 81 in the EU Parliament to adopt new rules for the CBAM, and that's going to start taking effect very, very quickly, with the idea that under the emissions trading system, that would increase costs for production inside the European Union in order to comply with many of the new emissions and environmental requirements. And this CBAM is a way to try to protect those European Union businesses by increasing the cost of imports that have a carbon price affixed to them going into the European Union. And you take a look at the CBAM goods that are covered: iron, steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, hydrogen, and importer is going to pay a price, a carbon price on that based on the differential if you have one in your home country versus that's being imported there. And the EU is going to start phasing in the CBAM in 2026, but importantly for some of you all that might be exporting into Europe, that starting in October 2023, exporters are going to need to register with the importing EU state as an authorized declarant, and you're going to have to file quarterly reports on your greenhouse gas emissions, but not only include direct, but also indirect emissions that are gone through production. There's a couple of things going on around the global steel community in particular about how to help customers of the steel industry, which are you all, then be able to calculate because any of your shipments that contain some of these carbon intense products might also fall into a declarant filing as well. I know, Paul, you put out some information on this as well. If you want to jump in here on the electric arc steel industry, putting out their emissions draft, because the world seems to be looking at this, or at least the steel world does, that we are going to have some kind of a carbon tariff on steel and aluminum, or at least coming to some parts of steel coming from the EU and possibly even the US.
Yeah, I think much similar to when the US imposed steel tariffs, the 232 steel tariffs, and all the way even going back to the 201 tariffs in 2002. The real beneficiary of these tariffs within the steel industry is the Nucors, the electric arc steel folks who use scrap to make steel, who back in 2002 we saw them with growing market share against the integrateds, and now obviously the balance has totally shifted. So you're starting to see some differences within the steel producing community regarding these proposed US EU carbon tariffs that we talked about on the last webinar, and that we've provided updates. As we've discussed, the tariff rate quotas that were put in place replaced the Section 232 steel tariffs on the EU last year. That was a one-year deal. So 1 year ago, the US and EU agreed that the US would change the tariffs on the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum to tariff rate quotas, and in return, the EU would not retaliate against US exports. So there was peace on the trade front, but that deal ends in October. And what they announced when they signed the original deal back last year was they were going to work towards a carbon deal where you're going to have a clean steel club between the US and EU, where if you're in the club, you had lower tariffs. If you're not in the club, meaning if you're China and other countries, you would have higher tariffs. But there's been, they've been negotiating for months on this. They have the deadline of October. It's not clear if they're going to reach a deal. We don't think that the tariffs will return, and that they might just give themselves more time. But there's some obstacles to be reached. But as we are seeing these negotiations going, the Nucor and the Steel Manufacturers Association have this Global Steel Climate Council where they have now announced their suggestions for a standard, and their goal is to make sure that the heavy emitters, the blast furnaces, the integrateds, don't get a separate, easier, less stringent standard than they do. So they have proposed a single standard that should go into, and they're actually taking comments on it through their website. But this is really the first, they've been talking about this for a few months, but this is the first really detail about what they're proposing, and it's really aimed at making sure that their competitors don't have an easier, less stringent standard than they do. So as we talk about the steel market, here is the latest from Steel Benchmarker report on hot rolled steel prices. As always, the blue line, which is the U.S. steel prices, and the gray one is EU, and the dark blue one is China. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the price differences haven't changed a great deal in the last month or so between the U.S. and China, which is that 710 mark number, and then between the U.S. and EU, the price difference in hot rolled steel is after going as low as $33 back in December of 2022 and as high as $334 in March, is down to $285. The number on the far right is the capacity utilization rate of the U.S. domestic steel industry. As we have told you in the past, the Biden administration in particular looks closely at this number. When back in the Trump administration, when the president imposed steel tariffs, in the Commerce Department report that supported imposition of the 232 tariffs, the Commerce Department said that the U.S. must have an 80% capacity utilization rate. So it's been hovering in the 70s, low 70s. It's actually up a little bit. So while, in the real world, I don't know if that number is significant, but politically that number is very significant. So we keep a close eye on it. So you can hear more about this on our podcast, Talking with One Voice, where Caitlin and I and John and Omar discuss all these issues. Every other week we put a new podcast up. They are available on all your podcast platforms, and give us a listen. If you like us, give us a rating. If you don't like us, just delete us. Don't do anything else.
Thanks, everybody. And as always, please type in any questions you have on the right-hand side. And if you found this information valuable, please do donate and support the advocacy program so we can continue bringing these to you once a month. As always, please, we'll stick on the line here for another 30 seconds or so. If anyone wants to type in a question for more details on anything that we did discuss, or if we left anything off that you'd like more background on. Again, it's going to be a pretty busy month coming in here, going in on the debt ceiling discussions and developments, hopefully on taxes. Not seeing any questions coming in at this time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we will do this all over again in about a month. Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.